afternoon to all of you. I hope the sound is okay here. As a professor in the research unit of linguistics, I warmly welcome all of you here for the defense of the PhD of Ms. Isabelle Heyerick, PhD entitled A Descriptive Study of Linguistic Interpreting Strategies in Dutch Flemish Sign Language Interpreting, exploring interpreters' perspectives to understand the what, how, and why. I would now like to invite Isabelle to give a brief presentation of her PhD.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome all. I am really delighted to stand here in front of you, even if it's with lockdown hair. And whether you're here physically or you're following online, I'm really delighted to be able to present to you my work. So this is the first doctoral study that examines Dutch, Flemish Sign Language, VGT, interpreting. And it specifically explores the topic of linguistic interpreting strategy used by interpreters who are hearing, children of deaf adults, new signers, and deaf. And it looks at a setting where monologic interpreting is used in a simultaneous mode, going from Dutch into VGT. Now, this presentation will give you an overview of the research questions, the topic, and the context of this study. I will also consider my position as a researcher, and then I will discuss the theoretical frameworks that shaped this study. I will give you an overview of the data collection methods, the data it generated, and how these were analyzed. And this will bring us to a summarized overview of the results and the main findings. So the study's hypothesis is that Dutch VGT interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategy and that this behavior is motivated. So the research homes in onto three basic questions. First of all, what is or what are strategies? How are they used and why are they used? And this translates into one general research question and three sub-questions, as you can see on the slide. So the study has three main aims, really. It wants to determine if Dutch VGT interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategies and then look at what is a strategy. So this is kind of the setup, the beginning of the study, you can say. And then it also wants to describe the specific interpreting strategies that emerged from the data and provide an operational definition for each of them. So this is describing the what and the how. And then it also wants to investigate what motivates interpreters' decision-making process and their linguistic choices, so the why of the research. And also additionally, the study wants to examine the interactions between strategies, triggers, motivations, kind of bringing the findings together so we get an overall view of what I call the strategic behavior of interpreters. Now, this study adopts what I would call a goal-oriented lens to the topic of simultaneous interpreting. So as an interpreter, the overall goal is to make communication possible, and it is presumed that in order to achieve that goal, interpreters use strategies. They make certain linguistic choices in order to make communication possible. So this work examines the cognitive processes of interpreting. It looks at the goal or the goals interpreters might have when they are interpreting and the decisions they make in order to reach that goal. Now, the study does understand interpreting to be a situated action, so it means that it acknowledges that considerations concerning society, language, culture, the profession itself, maybe even ideologies might influence the linguistic choices interpreters make. So this context of the study are interpreters in Flanders, so the sign language interpreting community in Flanders. So currently, hearing sign language interpreters in Flanders can be trained on the vocational and university level. And these interpreting programs in Flanders at this moment are only accessible for people who are hearing, for hearing students. At this point, there is not a dedicated training program for people who are deaf and who wish to become a sign language interpreter. Nonetheless, the community of practice in Flanders does consist of deaf and hearing interpreters. So both deaf and hearing interpreters are included in this study in order to make sure that it represents the sign language interpreting community as a whole. This study also looks at simultaneous interpreting. Now, as in many regions around the globe, and as in Flanders, sign language interpreters by default use the simultaneous mode. Doesn't matter if they're working in conference settings or community settings, and this is also why simultaneous interpreting was a topic of the research. Now, I want to briefly consider myself the researcher, and there are many things I can say about my position, but I want to home in on the relationships with the participants in my research. So 8 interpreters participated in this research, and I am an interpreter as well, but just to say that we were colleagues would not justify the multi-layeredness of our relationships. So some of the participants in my research have been my teachers in the training program, interpreting training program. Some have been my co-students, others have been my students. Some of them have been colleagues outside of interpreting. Some of them have been my clients as an interpreter, and I would say that some of them are my friends. So all of these identities, they did influence the data collection session methods, particularly the retrospective interviews, so where I would have an interview with the interpreter. And it kind of challenged the researcher researched and the insider-outsider dynamic, I think. And one example is, so during a retrospective interview, we would look at the interpretation, and sometimes an interpreter would ask me what I thought about what they had done, which of course conflicts with the aim as a researcher, where you want them to tell you what they did and why they did it. So if this happened, and if I was aware that this happened, I would reverse the question to make sure that I got their explanation. So just to summarize, as a researcher, I've tried to be mindful of taken for granted assumptions and blind spots that might be there in the relationships between the research participants and myself. However, Alvesen and Sjöldberg, they say that it is difficult, and if not by definition impossible, for the researcher to clarify the taken for granted assumptions and blind spots in their own social culture, their own research community and language. So I will now consider how the 3 basic questions, so the what, how, and why of interpreting strategies, have been addressed in previous translation and interpreting studies, and how these studies then in turn have shaped this research. So the first question I had to ask myself is, what is an interpreting strategy and how can we define the concept? And as you can see, the phenomenon of strategy has been researched before in translation studies, spoken language interpreting studies, and signed language interpreting studies. However, as you can also see on this slide, I have marked strategy there because not all scholars use the same term when they describe the phenomenon. And to be fair, not everybody would agree that what they are describing is actually a strategy. One example is Coakley, who actually says that they are miscues. And another scholar is Gilles, who says we should distinguish between tactics and strategies. However, overall, most scholars do use the term strategy, and it is also the term that is used in this research and which was defined for this research. Now, with regards to that definition, for this study, I turned to translation studies to compose a first, what I call an operational definition of what a strategy is, which then was used for this study and which was also revised at the end of the study. The definition I used draws on 3 of the 4 characteristics of a translation strategy, which is a distinction between product and process oriented, between problem solving and routines, and between global and local strategies. And as a departure point, I took the definition of translation strategy as offered by Isabelle Heyerick, who says that it is a specific pattern of behavior, that it can be linked to solving a problem or attaining a goal, that there is some level of consciousness, and that the aim the interpreter wants to reach can be reached by different paths. Now, in order to enable a discussion of which strategies Fichte interpreters use, I found it helpful to adopt a classification of interpreting strategies. And my study draws on the classification as proposed by Pöchacker, who says that strategies can be oriented towards the product or the process of interpreting. So product to entail the target text, but also the target audience, culture, etc. And the process is the managing of the interpreting process as it is. So this kind of description enables us to view the management of interpreting as entailing both product and process. Based on previous research that examined why strategies are used, this study also distinguishes between triggers and motivations. And it is my understanding that what I call triggers might correspond to what other scholars regard to be translation problems or interpreting problems. However, in this study, I chose to problematize the notion of problem. And in doing so, I align myself with researchers who agree that a strategy is not restricted to trying to solve a problem or to crisis management. And some scholars, such as Gambier, even question if it's favorable to embed strategies in the theory of translation or interpretation that puts problems central. Now, examples of triggers are, for instance, the density of the source text or the complexity of the source text. This can cause an interpreter to consider using a strategy. Now, motivations, on the other hand, reveal which goal the interpreter envisioned achieving when using a strategy. And these can be oriented towards different aspects of the interpreting activity, such as the product and the process. And some examples of motivations can be the interpreter wants to increase the comprehensibility of the target text, or the interpreter wants to add emphasis to the target text. So, as I said, 8 Dutch Fichte interpreters participated in this research. 4 of them are children of deaf adults, of which 2 are deaf and 2 are hearing. And the 4 other interpreters reported to be new signers, and of them also 2 are deaf and 2 are hearing. As you can see on the slide, all the hearing interpreters, the 4 at the bottom, are trained, so they are certified sign language interpreters, whereas for the deaf interpreters, only 1 deaf interpreter was in training at the time of the research. She was in training in an European Master of Sign Language Interpreting, and the other 3 deaf interpreters were not formally trained as interpreters. Now, turning to the method, this is the overview of the data collection method, which consisted of 4 parts. So first of all, there was an open-ended interview, and this was actually with the aim to describe the background of the 8 interpreters. So their personal background, linguistic background, professional background, and educational background. Then there was a preparation session of 1 hour, so each interpreter could prepare the source text during 1 hour, and they were asked to perform a think aloud process, just to say or sign whatever came up in their minds while they were preparing. This was then followed by the actual interpreting task, so they would simultaneously interpret the text they just prepared, and then the interpreter and myself would have a retrospective interview where we shortly discussed how the interpretation went, and then we did a task review. So we would look back at the interpretation, and the interpreter could stop whenever they thought something was of interest to share with me. I just want to briefly discuss the differences between the setup for the interpreting task for the hearing and the deaf interpreters, because obviously there is a difference in technicality there. So with the hearing interpreter, they would hear the source text directly through the audio, and they would interpret simultaneously for a deaf audience. There were always 2 deaf people present. Everything was video recorded and also recorded through a webcam. With the deaf interpreters, the source text was projected, so a written script of the source text was projected on the auto cue or teleprompter, Everything was video recorded and also with a webcam, and there was no audience present during the interpretation given by the deaf interpreters. Now, the source text for this research was an instructional video made by the Belgian government, and this video had as aim to explain to a Belgian citizen who was elected or selected to be the chair of a voting station what his or her tasks are on the day of the election. So this text was selected because in real life, interpreters, hearing and deaf, could be commissioned to translate or interpret such a text. The Flemish Deaf organization, Doof Vlaanderen, actually lobbies quite strongly, advocates for the accessibility of this type of information in Flemish Sign Language, a demand, as you can imagine, that has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the data collection sessions resulted in 4 data sets for each of the 8 interpreters. And then I would like to take you through how the analysis was done. So in order to determine whether an interpreting strategy was potentially used or rejected, my analysis departed from the retrospective interview. So the task review was my main source. So after transcribing or translating these interviews in Elan, instances when the interpreter mentioned thinking about using, having used, or rejecting a certain strategy were tagged in the whole interview. Once this was done for all the interpreters, a comparison across the 8 interpreters was done. And if 4 or more of the interpreters mentioned a particular strategy, that one was taken for further analysis. So what I did next was go back to the target text, so the interpreting text, and just go back to when the interpreter had said, oh, in that fragment of the text I used an addition, I would annotate that portion of the target text. That was then compared to the source text to see which shifts actually happened between source and target text. And then that was again compared to what was said during the task review. And if there was any unclarity or inconsistencies, I would go back to the Think Aloud protocol. So what the interpreter had said during the preparation, because maybe they did not comment on the strategy during the task review, but they might have said something during the preparation. So this is then how the analysis looked in Elan. And just briefly to give a clear picture of how we then come to the results and the definitions of the strategies. So for example, for addition, first a literature review was done for what we already know about the strategy addition. Then going back to the retrospective interview, if an interpreter said something about addition, that was selected. Then a source text and a target text comparison of that remark was made, which led to a proposed definition and a discussion of the triggers and the motivations. So briefly, and this was done for the strategies that emerged in this data set, of course. So this workflow kind of allows us to answer these questions about what, how, and why. And there was also analysis done to discern if there was any degree of uniformity between the interpreters. So when we turn to the results and the main findings, it is first important to say that a distinction is warranted between strategies that are applied and strategies that are rejected. So when we look at the applied strategies, in total, 19 applied strategies and 4 combinations were identified in the data. And then of these 19, 10 strategies were mentioned by 4 interpreters or more, and these were then, of course, analyzed in greater detail. Now, with regard to these 10 identified strategies, it is of interest to note that 3 are sign language specific, namely role shifting, the use of simultaneous construction, and fingerspelling. And also worth noting is that 4 out of these 10 strategies were mentioned by all 8 interpreters, namely the use of addition, substitution, omission, and role shifting. Now, when it comes to the rejected strategies, so strategies the interpreter had considered using but then decided not to use, the findings demonstrate that 5 strategies were mentioned as being rejected, and of these, one is sign language specific fingerspelling. So for each of these strategies, 11 in total, so the applied and the rejected, a discussion of when, how, and why they were used, and a definition based on previous studies from spoken and sign language interpreting studies, and on the results of the analysis was proposed. And on this slide, you see the definitions that have been proposed for those 4 applied strategies all interpreters mentioned, but the study provides a definition for all 11 strategies. Now, an important aim of this research was to understand why interpreters use or reject strategies. And analysis of the explanations offered by the interpreters led to a distinction between triggers and motivations. Now, triggers, based on the analysis of the data, and if the interpreters mentioned a trigger, because they did not always, it became clear that interpreters pointed to 3 different types of triggers. So there could be elements related to the source text or the source language, factors related to the interpreting process, and thirdly, matters related to the target audience. Now, with respect to the underlying motivations to use a certain linguistic interpreting strategy, I already told you that the categorization offered by Pöhacker was applied, and that distinguishes between product and process-oriented. However, the results of the analysis of this study warranted an expansion of these categories with a third one, which entails strategies that are oriented both to the process and the product. So one strategy aimed at both. Now, when we revisit the hypothesis of the study, as mentioned at the start of this presentation, this research confirms that VGT interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategies when interpreting from Dutch into VGT in a monologic simultaneous interpreting setting, and that the strategic behavior is motivated. Additionally, the results demonstrated that the strategic behavior is motivated and spans over applied and rejected strategies. 10 applied strategies and 5 rejected strategies were investigated in detail, and the examination of why interpreters used or rejected strategies led to a distinction between triggers and motivations and a classification of product, process, and product and process-oriented motivations, as discussed in the previous slides. Now, with regards to the sub-question about the uniformity, so is there a degree of uniformity in how interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategies? This study did not reveal a degree of uniformity. On the contrary, a rather high amount of interpersonal variation was observed. And I'm happy to discuss this further with the jury if they should have any questions about that. Now, the 3 aims the study set itself out to achieve are also the 3 main contributions of the research. First of all, a general definition of what a linguistic strategy is, as used in this study, based on previous research and on the results of the data analysis. Secondly, a description of 11 linguistic interpreting strategies and operational definitions for each of them. And thirdly, a detailed report on what triggers and motivates interpreters' decision-making process and their linguistic choices. And additionally, the research offers insights into how triggers, motivations, and strategies interact. And it confirms that there is a connection between the local and global strategies, as has been suggested by Gambier. So global strategies, underpinned by what the interpreters view to be the aim, the main aim, the overall aim of the interpretation, affected the local strategies they applied, considered applying, or rejected. So in other words, the goal the interpreter aims to achieve with the interpretation had its consequences on the linguistic strategies they used or rejected. The research also underpinned that strategies are codependent and they interact with each other. A first type of interaction observed is the data is between applied strategies. The choice for one strategy will lead to a next strategic consideration or decision. And secondly, the study established that the choice to not use, so to reject a certain strategy, of course also influences the use of another strategy. It goes without saying that the rejection of a strategy means that you first have to consider using that strategy. You will then reject it, but you will have to choose another strategy, which then becomes the applied strategy, and then the circle starts again. So these findings lead to the general conclusion that signed language interpreting, or all interpreting, is strategic in nature. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.